Hello and welcome back to Good Game Nation, where we bring you all things TCG. My name's Preston, and today we are talking about OP-08 Green as our color review series continues. And again, I talk a lot about what I think about these cards as they come out, and I was really apprehensive about it, but I think this deck is a hidden killer because it has absolutely so many cards that are just plain rude. Let's start out with our leader, which I think is a pretty decent leader effect here. Activate main once per turn if you have a character with Mink type on your side of the field. Place up to one of your opponent's characters with 5 or less into rest. Being able to rest your opponent's characters with an ability on leader is pretty great, and that ability comes at a minimum of a 1 cost to bring out a single Mink. And resting a 5 or less is really interesting because you hit a decent amount of cards, but it means at the beginning of your end game you could rest a blocker at 5 or less. And thinking about stuff like going back a few sets where like Law played only 5 or less, there's times in the history of this game where you could hit every card in an opponent's deck. And thinking of the Law blocker being one of the biggest blockers that was played generally, being able to rest that off the top of your turn and just be able to go in without having that blocker on board is great. Now, with that being said, a lot of the cards that came out in this set have a very similar effect with just different ranges that they affect. So all of the cards that we'll talk about very briefly will not have the same effect of will not activate during your opponent's next refresh phase, with the cost of what they can do being different. So this one is if your leader has up to 2 of your opponent's rested characters with 5 or less will not be active. So at a 5 cost, you hit 2 of your opponent's cards that will not be available for attacking the next turn, which is crazy. Then we can move on to here, and this is on play, and when attacking, up to one of your opponent's rested character with 7 or cost will not become active. So on play, and then again, if she gets to attack, a 7 or less does not become active. Just an alt art. This is a 4 or less, does not become active. This is a 3 or less, does not become active. Dawn times 1 when attacking your opponent's rested, up to one of your opponent's rested character of 1 or less will not become active for the next refresh phase. A little bit slower, probably less important, but a low cost card that you could play early game, which puts the pressure on them to not attack because they don't want that card to not ever come back. If your opponent has 7 or more rested cards, this card gains rush. So if you're able to, the way that it's worded, 7 isn't possible to have full character. So if your opponent has 7 rested Dawn, you can play this card and it gains rush. That's my understanding of it. And then this is the Peckhams that we've talked about. Your Minks with 3 or less cannot be KO'd by effect if this card is active, and we are worried about this card not being able to attack, but as we'll get to it, Zhao helps that, and some other cards will also help that restand itself. This is a nice rare that is a blocker that gains effects when it's KO'd, so that's a lovely touch. That the blocker also has an on-KO effect. We love to see it. It rests your opponent's Dawn or KOs a 6 or less, which is a great option for each of them. If you can get a KO early on this character and rest one of your opponent's Dawns, that takes away from their counting. A lot of people like to count out their turn and figure out what they can do, and if they have to deal with a potential loss of 1 Dawn off of this blocker, that could throw off their entire turn, or if they get a KO on this card late, they could lose their Dawn that they were going to hold up for counter, which could be potentially heartbreaking for a turn. Moving on, activate one of your characters with mink cost 2 or less, so this will restand. Rest this character to activate one of your Dawn, so a little bit of Dawn manipulation. If your leader has mink and your opponent has 7 or more rested cards, KO up to a rested character with 2 or less, so on play KO at 1 cost. Pretty decent, especially if you can rest something with your leader and then KO it with this. Not a bad little combo. There's going to be probably more aggressive and stronger combos than that, but an option to get rid of a pesky blocker at 2 costs or less. This is our searcher, searches everything other than herself with mink type, which again, an on-play searcher is great, immediate action is good, and this searches all minks except for herself. So we can look at old mink cards in a second to see if there's anything there that is worth searching. And then we have our events, which this is a disgusting rare event that all of your opponent's characters that are rested at 7 costs or less do not become active during the next refresh phase. So again, this deck is so manipulative, and it's going to make your opponent consider every single thing they do. So if you have your opponent is all tapped out and maybe even has a full board, and you rest everybody or force them to not be able to activate those rested characters, all they can do is activate their leader for the next turn and then play rush over the top of rested characters. This is a very, very disruptive card, and it doesn't have anything to do with mink, so every green deck can play this card. So pretty disgusting card we have here. Put one of your characters with mink trait, so it's a 1-for-1, rest yours, rest theirs. Rest 2 of yours. Your characters can't be KO'd until the opponent's next turn by effects, which is pretty cool for a 1 cost. And it's a very expensive cost of resting your own characters, just so that they can't be KO'd by effects. But at 1 cost Dawn, you have to figure out if that works into your strategy. I feel like the resting 2 of your cards ends up being too expensive. And then it just says elephant. Zoe. Main, you may rest this stage if your leader has minks. Activate one of your Dawn, which is pretty cool. At the end of your turn, activate up to one of your characters with mink. So we could use this on Peckhams. We could use this on something like Carrot that attacks and you want it to be able to come back and attack again. And keeping it out of rest means it can't be KO'd by traditional means, so attacking straight into it. And then you can play other stuff, like if Peckhams is active, they can't KO it by effects, so it's pretty defended at that point. So yeah, all your cards are pretty well defended, so you have Peckhams on board. Cards can't be KO'd by effects if they fit the criteria here of a 3 or less, which would mean Carrot is not defended in that case. But the rest of your little weenies that are stopping your opponent from reactivating are protected there. So what am I learning out of this set? I think it's going to be a very sneaky deck that will take off wins because your opponent and as players aren't going to know immediately how to deal with this type of aggression. This is probably the most aggressive board control that we've seen so far. We saw a little bit with Dofi where it would be able to hold cards in rest, but that was at the end game. This is throughout, so it's so rough. Even if you activate these guys on blockers that have already blocked, they can't restand and block again. Gives you an extra turn to find aggression to KO them. They still do their job of drawing attacks away from leader, but man, I think it's just going to be a very sneaky deck. I think at the beginning of the format, I think it will pull a lot more wins. Then we will find ways to adapt. There's not a lot of coverage for everybody, so Peckhams doesn't protect everybody. Zhao isn't going to be able to protect everybody. It's only one card at a time. So there's going to be ways to do things. Man, it's rough. I think it's going to be rough to play against this deck at first. And it's going to be rough to choose this deck over one of the hyper-aggressive decks that are currently in the high meta. I think here in the West, we have the advantage of being able to strategize against this deck for longer, but I think in Japan, this is going to pull some wins really early. Then we'll be able to adapt and play around it and figure out how to beat this without being negatively affected by all of these locked cards. And it's hard not to suggest this deck early on. It's hard not to suggest this deck at all because in most of these color reviews, I talk about one or two cards. I looked at every single card in this set, and I had something that I thought was interesting about it. And it's hard not to say, try this deck, because I think a lot of the cards are interesting. And I think that board state control can be really punishing. And if we can find a really good build that abuses every single turn, and stops and gets you to a point where you're locking your entire opponent's board, running up even into like 10 cost Dofi, playing those at the end game to finish the game, has the potential of running that. So I would say try it. I absolutely am going to try it because I want to know if it has the potential. And right now it looks like it has a ton of potential, and I think that it has enough going for it to see some play, and the competitive players will eventually find a way around it, and then you'll just jump back to the high competitive deck. But I do think this has an easy potential of stealing some stuff early on. But with that being said, let me know if I'm completely off base in the comments. I would love to hear your opinions on Carrot and the Mink Tribe cards that came out. I would love to hear your opinion in the comments. Let me know if I'm completely missing the point here. And if you let's try that one more time. If you like this video, hit that thumbs up. If you want to get more One Piece TCG content, hit that subscribe. And until next time, peace.